On the 8th of May, 1660, Charles II was proclaimed king. The following day, the Lords appointed a committee, quotes, to consider and receive information where any of the king's goods, jewels or pictures are, and to advise of some course how the same may be restored to His Majesty. On the 12th of May, the Lords issued an order for the return of the royal goods within 7 days. When Charles II rode into London on the 29th of May, the palaces of Whitehall, Somerset House and St James's must have been made presentable. On the 14th of August, the King issued a proclamation commanding the return of goods formerly belonging to his father, his mother, or himself to the Master of the Wardrobe by the 29th of September. This was made legally binding through the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, passed on the 29th of August. The committee relied on the artist George Geldorp, who had been active in artistic circles since the time of James I, the trustees of the Commonwealth Sale, who had to submit all their papers to the committee, and officers such as Colonel William Hawley and Colonel Hercules Lowe, who were empowered to seize declared and concealed goods. So began the slow and extremely complicated process of retrieving the late King's possessions. The diarist Thomas Rugg saw in the Jewel Office in Whitehall, quotes, carpets, hangings, pictures, medals, inscriptions and pieces of art, rich beds, curtains and valet come in hilter-skelter. Though the Act of Indemnity specifically excluded from prosecution those royal servants and creditors who had received works of art in payment of debts incurred by Charles I, many royal servants chose to return them anyway, no doubt in the hope of receiving future royal favour. Hoping to be reinstated as Sergeant Painter, Emmanuel de Critz returned Tintoretto's Esther and Ahasuerus and Bernini's incomparable head in marble. Peter Lely was quick to declare 7 pieces of sculpture, a frame and 8 paintings, including Van Dyck's Cupid and Psyche and the 3 eldest children. A month later, on the 20th of June 1660, Charles II invited him to court as limner and picture drawer to the King. He was granted an annual pension of £200, quote, as formerly to Sir Van Dyck. Others were slower. It was into September before Lord Lisle, the nephew of the Duke of Northumberland, sent from his house at Sheen an impressive collection which included these 2 paintings. On the eve of the Restoration at Breda, Charles II asked William Fritzell, a picture dealer with whom his father had had many transactions in the 1630s, to keep for him a group of 72 old master pictures until they were sent for, in anticipation of needing to furnish empty palaces. In November, a second group of fine paintings and antique sculptures was presented to the King by the states of Holland and West Friesland. These acquisitions of old masters forged a strong affiliation with the taste of Charles I, helped recreate his collection and re-establish his son's image as king. The large number of 16th century Italian paintings in Fritzell's purchase would have helped to minimise the loss of his father's Italian paintings, but there was also a good representation of Netherlandish, Dutch and Flemish. Most highly prized at 1,200 florins was Martin von Heemskick's Deluge, which is now lost, followed by 1,000 florins for Heemskick's 4 Last Things and Bruegel's Massacre of the Innocents. Was it a bulk purchase, or would Charles II have had the opportunity to select from Fritzel's stock at Breda? And if so, was he interested in choosing particular works? If that is the case, perhaps the choice of Italian shows a taste learnt from his upbringing, while the preponderance of Northern reflects his own taste. But it is perhaps surprising that despite his many years in exile at the court of Louis XIV, there were only three French paintings in the purchase. The states of Holland and West Friesland made inquiries as to what would most please the king when planning their gift, and learnt that Italian paintings and antique sculptures were preferred to works by modern masters. The purchase of the 24 paintings, all probably Italian, and 12 antique sculptures was made from the Gerard and Jan Reinst collection, then owned by the widow of Gerard. To this was added 4 more paintings by Northern artists, 3 of which were from the collection of Gerrit Dou, including one by himself, the outstanding young mother. The formal presentation of the diplomatic gift to the king in the banqueting house, with all the court in attendance, would have recalled similar ceremonies at the court of his father, surrounded by courtly connoisseurs. According to reports from the Dutch ambassador, Charles particularly admired Titian's Virgin and Child in a Landscape with Tobias and the Angel, and the paintings by Dou and Elsheimer. However, this prized Titian was already installed by 1666, whereas the Dou was in the King's Closet in Whitehall. It has been calculated that Charles I's art collection had numbered about 1,570 paintings. The inventories compiled under James II in about 1688 reveal that at the end of Charles II's reign, he owned 1,078 paintings. It's difficult to calculate how many of those once belonged to his father. The inventory of 1666-7, probably drawn up by William Chiffinch, who took over from his brother Thomas as keeper of the Privy Closet after the latter's death in April 1666, lists 450 paintings, pictures and limnings at Whitehall, and over 213 at Hampton Court. Like Van der Dort's inventory, this inventory is organised by room. The provenance, such as Dutch present or Fritzel, is noted, and also, crucially, measurements are given for each work, which helps us with identifications. In it, about a quarter, that is 200 of the 858 paintings, are reclaimed Charles I paintings. It should be possible to get some sense of the proportion of Charles I's paintings in the James II inventories, and until then, a quarter or a third seems plausible. In 1663, Balthasar de Montcornis reported that when he was admiring the treasures in the cabinet room at Whitehall, the king came in and addressed him in his usual easy way. Quotes, "He said he was delighted that I should see what he had, but that it was not half of what his father had owned. As Andrew Barclay has pointed out, a half of his father's collection could apply to the whole of the royal collection." So just to show what we're looking at here in this print of Whitehall, we only have a record of the ground floor of Whitehall, but what we're always interested in is these buildings down here, which are, this is the Privy Gallery, and this is the Long or Massive Gallery, and these are the Privy lodgings where Charles I had, and this, of course, is the banqueting house. Paintings were retrieved, there were gifts and new commissions, but the level of quality inevitably was less high than 30 years before. Comparing the 1666 inventory with Van der Dort shows that major paintings were returned to key positions and the same type of paintings were hung in the same rooms, so that there was a continuity with his father's world. So that's showing this key area with a reconstruction by Simon Thurley. Van Dyck's great piece was once more at the end of the long or matted gallery, followed by predominantly old masters, mythological and religious. The family of Henry VIII, with other Tudor paintings, reappear in the Privy Gallery, with a dynastic series of kings and queens. Charles I's Privy Lodgings focused on pre-eminent artists, Titian, Correggio, Raphael and Giulio Romano, in carefully arranged hangs. Charles II was less rigorous, more casual. For example, in his second Privy Lodging room, Gossart's Adam and Eve is amongst Schiavone, Tintoretto and Jacopo Bassano. Returned to the King's bedchamber are Van Dyck's Cupid and Psyche and close family portraits. Van Dyck's Henrietta Maria and Mytons of Prince Henry, which were also in Charles I's hang. These are now brought up to date with more recent portraits. Huysmans' Catherine of Braganza, Wright's portrait of his favourite sister, Princess Henrietta Anne, later Duchess of Orleans, and Adrian Hanneman's portrait of Charles's young nephew, William III, when Prince of Orange. Pepys quotes, "Could have spent 3 or 4 hours there well in the cabinet, where there were the finest small paintings, the miniatures and highly prized copies of old master paintings, masterpieces by Holbein, Correggio, Palmavecchio, Titian, Parmigianino, Dosso Dossi, Andrea da Sarto, Bronzino, Steenwijk, Clouet, Rottenhammer, Elsheimer, Brill and Neves. There were gifts from courtiers such as Sir John Finch, who presented the courtly Salome for the king and the highly emotional penitent Magdalene for the queen. A group of at least 14 paintings were purchased from John Michael Wright's Lottery, who painted the most impressive presentation of the sovereign restored. But not apparently for the king. This is Charles II in Parliament robes, wearing the crown of state under a canopy of state, may have been commissioned for the Guildhall, or by the wealthy banker and royal goldsmith Robert Vyner, who became Lord Mayor in 1674 and made the new coronation regalia depicted in the painting. Instead, Charles II desired the completely different commission of the unusual triple portrait of one of his favourite actors, John Lacy. Peter Lely was responsible for creating the official likenesses of the king. Charles II apparently took, quotes, great pleasure in his conversation, which he found to be as agreeable as his pencil. Pepys visited Lely's studio in June 1662 and noted amongst other portraits, quotes, another of the king that is not finished and most rare, which was probably a head study kept for the purposes of copying. Charles II wanted to exercise control over images of himself that were painted and circulated, but neither he nor his brother, the Duke of York, were interested in displaying the grand authoritarian equivalents of Van Dyck's portraits of their father in the royal palaces. There were 17 portraits of the king in the studio at Ledy's death in 1680, but it appears that Charles did not own a finished portrait of himself by the artist, and the one I'm showing was probably one of these that was left unfinished in the studio. Similarly, there were 16 copies of portraits in the Duke of York, portraits of the Duke of York in Lely's studio, but James II's inventory of 1688 records only 3 unfinished portraits, all in St James's Palace. Lely painted little for Charles II himself, but found a more rewarding source of patronage in the king's brother, James, Duke of York, and his first wife, Anne Hyde. The series of portraits, later known as the Windsor Beauties, were hung in the expensively furnished White Room at St James's Palace on wall hangings made of white sarcenet, a silk material, and of blue mohair. Below were displayed 6 long panels telling the story of Jacob by the then highly esteemed artist Andrea Schiavone. Here is an interesting continuation of Charles I's approach to room decoration, with the creation of symmetrical hands and the bringing together of complementary sets into one room. Charles II's tutor, the Earl of Newcastle, had advised the king, "For the arts, I would have you know them so far as they are of use." Charles could have interpreted this advice as making sure he was knowledgeable about the arts, or alternatively, that he should be a more pragmatic and restrained collector than his father. Though he had reacquired the album of Holbein's and the famous album of Leonardo drawings from the Earl of Arundel, we have no record of what he actually thought about drawings. He didn't have the same manner of pursuing art as his father. He seems to have enjoyed the company of artists. He was fond of miniatures, acquiring several from the widow of Samuel Cooper, one of the most outstanding artists of this period. Another continuity with his father's reign for both Charles and James was the Roman Catholicism of their consorts. Charles patronised Roman Catholic painters such as Huysmans and French artists such as Simon Verilist and Henri Gascard, or the brothers Claude and Philippe Vignon. With the return of the Stuarts, Cardinal Barberini started again to send over contemporary paintings from Rome, directed towards the Duke of York, even when nominally for the king. A large Romanelli of Bacchus finding Ariadne on Naxos, and a copy of the Guido Reni painting of the same subject, which had been commissioned for Henrietta Maria, were destined as restoration presents to Charles II in about 1660. And I apologise for the image at the top, it's the only one I could find. Anne Hyde, who was eventually received into the Roman Catholic Church before her death in 1671, owned the fine Domenichino, St Agnes, which she kept in her private apartments in St James's. Charles I had failed to tempt Guercino to England, and many say that only too easily did Charles II acquire Benedetto Gennari, Guercino's nephew. Working in the classical tradition of Guercino and the Italian old artist so prized by Charles I, Gennari produced 102 paintings during the reign of Charles II, 35 during the reign of James II, and 30 for James in exile, when he joined, whom he joined at Saint-Germain-en-Laye. For Charles, Gennari painted the erotic mythological, such as these for the King's dining room at Windsor, displayed with Tintoretto's 9 Muses and Schiavone's Judgment of Midas. For Catherine of Braganza, James II and Mary of Modena, he supplied religious paintings for the chapels at St James's Palace, Windsor Castle and Somerset House. It was the site of Gennari's new altarpieces, such as the Annunciation for the new Catholic chapel at Whitehall, combined with ceilings by Antonio Verrio, which amazed John Evelyn, writing in 1666, quote, "The world of mysterious ceremony, something he believed I should ever have lived to see such things in the King of England's palace." In the autumn of 1664, Evelyn recorded that he was casually in the Privy Gallery at Whitehall speaking to the king, who asked him whether he had a crayon and a paper. Evelyn presented him with both, and laying it on the window stool, he with his own hand designed to me the plot for the future building of Whitehall, together with the rooms of state and other particulars. The king's deep interest in architecture and interior decoration, his use of it to reinforce and consolidate his and his family's legitimacy, as his cousin Louis XIV was achieving at Versailles and the Louvre, can be seen at Windsor Castle, where there were the largest and most extraordinary series of Baroque interiors ever created in Britain. Something that Charles I did not achieve. The whole visionary effect depended on the collaboration of Hugh May's architecture, René Cousin's gilding, Grinling Gibbon's carvings, and Antonio Verrio's frescoes. Verrio, who had assisted Charles Lebrun at Versailles, presented to the king this large sea triumph, and with that success, he and his Italian or Flemish assistants went on to paint 19 ceilings and 3 staircases, together with St. George's Hall and the King's Chapel. The iconography glorified the monarchy and was propagandist. So in this, which is the Privy Chamber at Windsor, you can see Catherine of Braganza really in the role of Britannia, descending in the centre of the whole scene. In the chapel, the king, Christ-like, healed by the ceremony of touching the evil. The north wall, ingeniously, had a fictive architectural side aisle, so I'm talking about this, containing a Mantegna-like antique-style victory procession, which also recalls the columns in Raphael's cartoon of the healing of the lame man. The ceiling here, as throughout the castle, looks back at Rubens's ceiling in the banqueting house, where tapestries were once hung in place of Verrio's decoration. In St. George's Hall, it was the restitution of the Order of the Garter that was celebrated. Francis Haskell has argued that in this country, after Charles I, there was a complete absence of the works of the most preeminent artists, Raphael, Titian, Correggio, right up until the French Revolution and the Napoleonic invasion of Italy, and that therefore Stuart collecting proved to be ephemeral, an anomaly that lacked substructure. Yet one could argue that Charles I's collection proved to be the foundation of all subsequent collection by the monarchy, and has always been deeply etched into the country's taste. The way in which the monarchy is represented always comes back to Charles I. The composition of the jewel-like Mignard of James II and his family in exile is based on the Great Peace, right down to the son as heir to the throne and the little dog. By returning to the iconography of Charles I's state portrait, William III and the Hanoverians reinforced their legitimacy. Subsequent monarchs have tried to retrieve Charles I's collection, add works by the same artist to it, and display the collection with the same underlying blueprint. So I'm just showing you there this, which is George I, clearly dependent on the National Gallery painting, which had, by this 1701, had been bought by the Duke of Marlborough and was really the first painting in Charles I's collection really to return to this country. When William III assembled his old master hang in the new King's Gallery at Kensington, he hung the 2 large Van Dycks at either end, with 2 great Tintorettos and other Italian paintings densely hung in between. William Kent reframed and thinned the hang for George I, but the principles were the same. When Caroline of Ansbach created her closet at Kensington, filled with pictures, drawings, miniatures, cameos, gemstones, she was replicating Charles I's cabinet room. Surmounting one of the cabinets was a crystal bust of Charles I. Though she absolutely loathed her son, Frederick Prince of Wales, he too was a great collector, and was also proud of his closet at Carlton House. In the mid-18th century, Horace Walpole saluted, quotes, the first era of real taste in England when talking about Frederick, Prince of Wales. And he and George Virtue investigated and, Horace Walpole's quote was about Charles I, the first era of real taste in England. And he and George Virtue investigated and published Charles I's activities as patron and collector for Frederick. Virtue wrote, no prince since King Charles I took so much pleasure nor observations on works of art or artists, and that's in connection with Frederick. George I acquired new Rubenses and hung this Holy Family with paintings then thought to be by Titian, Bassano, Veronese and Michelangelo in the great drawing room at Kensington. Later, Frederick, Prince of Wales, added paintings to the collection by Rubens and Van Dyck. These were the two greatest contemporary artists patronised by Charles I, and these Hanoverians were therefore reinstating them or reinforcing them. George III and George IV brought back into the Royal Collection some of the key paintings by Van Dyck and Rubens, the Roi à la Chasse being the only missed opportunity. It was Van Dyck that came to symbolise the romance of the lost Stuart age, manifested in the fashion for Van Dyck dress. And here is George III and his family in the Zoffany. Above all, the Mantegna's triumph and the Raphael cartoons have always given the Royal Collection the authority of preeminent works of art on a magnificent scale. Reynolds considered the cartoons, as well as Michelangelo and Raphael frescoes at the Sistine Chapel, quotes, the principal works of modern art. The transfer of Raphael's cartoons from Hampton Court, where they could be seen, to George III and Queen Charlotte's private Buckingham House, allegedly to preserve them from damp, was savagely attacked by Wilkes in the House of Commons when he wrote, at present they are perishing in a late baronet's smoky house at the end of a great smoky town. When the National Gallery was founded in 1824, Benjamin Haydon asked, will any gallery which excludes the cartoons of Andrea Mantegna and Raphael be a national gallery? Charles I's collection by now well and truly had become part of the national consciousness. Thank you.